Hello and welcome to The Top Story, a podcast with the headlines of the day from our correspondents around the world. I'm Qi Zhi. Coming up in this edition, mediators in Doha have expressed hope for a ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas in the coming days. The U.S. Federal Reserve has reduced interest rates by 25 basis points, marking the third consecutive cut in this easing cycle. And southern African countries are reeling from extreme weather events, with millions of people struggling to cope with the deadly forces of nature. We begin with the Middle East. Mediators in Qatar's capital have expressed hope for a ceasefire and hostage release deal between Israel and Hamas in the coming days. As talks aiming to end the fighting in Gaza continue in Cairo, the UN Security Council has also held a meeting on the conflict. Mitch McCann sent this report from New York.
Amid reports that mediators are closing in on a ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas, Israel's ambassador to the United Nations speculated on what such an agreement might look like. Danny Danon told the press before entering the Security Council meeting that a ceasefire might occur in stages.
I'm not sure it will be in one stage. We hope it will be in one stage because we want to see all the hostages back home. Maybe it will not be in one stage, and basically it will be similar to what we saw in the past, more than a year ago, that you have a ceasefire, a long one, and at the same time of the ceasefire, during that ceasefire, hostages will be released.
At the Security Council, members were briefed on the dire situation in Gaza and were informed that approximately 250 Palestinians had been killed in the past week as a result of Israeli strikes. Despite ongoing discussions of a ceasefire, Israel's Defense Force ordered another evacuation in central Gaza overnight, ahead of an expected offensive there. Meanwhile, Israel says it has carried out successful strikes targeting Hamas militants who are planning an attack on Israeli soldiers operating in Jabalia.
A ceasefire is long overdue. The continued collective punishment of the Palestinian people is unjustifiable. The relentless bombardment of Gaza by Israeli forces, the larger number of civilian casualties, the blanket destruction of Palestinian neighborhoods, and the worsening humanitarian situation are horrific.
US Ambassador to the United Nations Linda Thomas-Greenfield said it's crucial that the release of hostages be part of any agreement, rather than simply allowing Hamas to negotiate a ceasefire.
Instead, we must speak with one voice and demand that Hamas agree to release the hostages they're holding so that we can implement the deal on the table. To end the suffering of hostages from more than a dozen member states and millions of Palestinian civilians in Gaza, and to put the parties back on a path toward a two-state solution.
Health officials in Gaza say that 45,000 Palestinians have died since the war began in October 2023.
That was Mitch McCann in New York. Elsewhere in the Middle East, the UN Special Envoy for Syria has called for free and fair elections in the country. Guy Peterson says there's a lot of hope to see the beginning of a new Syria as he wrapped up his trip to Damascus. Philip Crowther with the Associated Press reports from the Syrian capital.
UN Special Envoy Pedersen also could not really have imagined himself being here in Damascus just 10 days ago. Despite being the Special Envoy for Syria, he had to do almost all of his work from afar. Now he's able to brief the Security Council in New York from here, from Damascus, after having met the interim government, an interim government that of course is largely made up of members of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, that is the main rebel group, Islamist group that has now taken over power. Pedersen here in Damascus calling for an inclusive transition and one that includes the broadest range of Syrian society and parties.
There are a few challenges. One is that the conflict isn't over yet. Yes, there is stability in Damascus, but there are challenges in some areas, and of course one of the biggest challenges is the situation in the northeast. I'm very pleased that the truce have been renewed and that it seems to be holding, but hopefully we will see a political solution to that issue. Then the second, and that of course is a major challenge for all, as you all know, is the scale of the economic challenges. We need immediate humanitarian assistance, but we also need to make sure that Syria can be rebuilt that we can see economic recovery, and that we can hopefully see the beginning where we start the process to end sanctions. And third, but not last, of course, it is the importance of making sure that we have a political transition that will be credible, inclusive, and include the broadest range of the Syrian society and Syrian parties.
He also wants this transition to happen under the existing UN framework. This was put in place for there to be a political solution between the government of Bashar al-Assad and the opposition during the civil war. That, of course, not necessary anymore, but that is the framework that the United Nations still want to use here. A call also for free and fair elections from the UN here in Syria. We simply don't know whether the new leadership here in Damascus has those plans after the transition officially comes to an end here in March. But those in charge of the transition, the interim government, the new Islamist government of the new Syria, they will, though, be happy to hear from Pedersen, the UN Special Envoy for Syria, that he wants to see a start to the process to end Western sanctions. That has been one of the most important, loudest calls from this interim government for Syria to somehow get out of the economic disaster it found itself in under President Assad.
That is AP correspondent Philip Crowther in Damascus. Turning to North America, the U.S. Federal Reserve has reduced interest rates by 25 basis points, marking the third consecutive cut in this easing cycle. This also represents the final rate reduction under the Biden administration. James Bellman reports.
This is the third consecutive rate cut after a 0.5% cut in September and a 0.25% cut in November. The quarter-point cut means rates are now a full point lower since the Fed began cutting rates in September. The move comes as the U.S. has experienced strong economic growth and a robust labor market, but inflation remains an issue. Though well down from the peak of about 9% in 2020, inflation in November ticked up to 2.7%. The Fed target is 2%.
The economy is strong overall and has made significant progress toward our goals over the past 2 years. The labor market has cooled from its formerly overheated state and remains solid. Inflation has moved much closer to our 2% longer run goal.
The Fed has also announced it expects 2 rate cuts in 2025. That's down from previous projections that suggested 4 rate cuts were coming next year. That's a signal that the Fed expects inflation to remain an issue. This is the last meeting of the Fed before Donald Trump is sworn in as president. It's unclear how the situation will change under the incoming Trump administration. Trump says he won't remove Fed Chief Jerome Powell, who he appointed to the post in 2018. Trump has said he wants input on setting rate cuts, a major shift from the independence traditionally enjoyed by the Federal Reserve. And Trump has been clear he likes low rate cuts to juice the economy. Another thing to keep in mind, some of the policies Trump is promising, including tariffs and mass deportations, could have a major impact on the economy in 2025 and could impact the Fed's decisions next year and beyond. Consumers are not likely to see major changes right away. Since the Fed began cutting rates in September, credit card rates, car loans have dipped slightly, but mortgages have remained relatively unchanged. And those relatively high mortgage rates, between 6% and 7%, have played a major role in why so many Americans are struggling despite a relatively strong economy.
That was Jim Spellman on the latest Fed interest rates decision. In Europe, annual inflation in the Eurozone rose for the second consecutive month in November. The European Central Bank lowered interest rates last week and has signaled that further cuts may follow. William Densler reports.
Inflation across the European Union's single currency zone ticked up to 2.2% in November, up from 2% the month previous. According to the EU Statistics Office Eurostat, Luxembourg, Ireland and Lithuania posted the lowest annual inflation levels. Belgium was among the highest, seeing inflation tick up to 4.8%. Germany, Europe's largest economy, saw inflation hold steady for the month at 2.4%. Looking at the wider European Union, November's average consumer prices ticked up to 2.5% compared to 2.3% in October. November's top-line inflation figure came in slightly lower than analysts expected. The European Central Bank has cut interest rates 4 times this year and says that efforts to ease price pressures are going according to plan. While the ECB's President Christine Lagarde says it's too early to declare mission accomplished, she says the darkest days of winter look to be behind us. Back in 2022, inflation hit a record high of 10.6%, fueled by the lingering impact of COVID-19 and the war in Ukraine. Now the ECB predicts inflation to hit 2.1% next year, before dropping below its benchmark rate of 2% in 2026. Lagarde has signalled that there'll be more rate cuts in the coming months, but maintains that any decisions will be data dependent.
That was William Denslow on the Eurozone's inflation figure. Finally, in Africa, Southern Africa is reeling from several extreme weather events which have left a trail of death and destruction in their wake this year. From violent cyclones and snowstorms to enduring droughts and high temperatures, millions of people have struggled to cope with the deadly forces of nature. Robert Nigella has more.
The latest extreme weather event occurred in northern Mozambique over the weekend. A cyclone Chedo swept from the Indian Ocean and devastated much of Cabo Delgado province, killing 34 people. Over 300 people were injured. By then, the weather system was already guilty of causing death and destruction elsewhere. The people on the small island of Mayotte, an island between Mozambique and Madagascar, suffered terribly. Hundreds are believed to have lost their lives, with rescue efforts still ongoing. Meanwhile, South Africa can count a number of such extreme weather events. In January, a huge storm killed 41 people in KwaZulu-Natal and Free State provinces. Then, in July, a snowstorm in Johannesburg brought with it dangerously low temperatures, forcing road closures and creating major disruptions. At least 22 people were killed. KwaZulu-Natal and Free State were hit again in September when 2 people were killed in a late-season snowstorm. Still in September, 6 countries in the region, Botswana, Lesotho, Malawi, Namibia, Zambia and Zimbabwe, all declared a state of emergency due to a drought fueled by El Nino. The drought killed hundreds of wild animals and livestock and left millions in need of humanitarian assistance.
That was Robert Nigella on extreme weather events that have struck southern Africa this year. Now, recapping the headlines before we go, mediators in Doha, Qatar, have expressed hope for a ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas in the coming days. The U.S. Federal Reserve has reduced interest rates by 25 basis points, marking the 3rd consecutive cut in its easing cycle. And southern African countries are reeling from extreme weather events, with millions struggling to cope with the deadly forces of nature. And that's it for this edition of The Top Story, a podcast that brings you world headlines every weekday. For more news in politics, business, sports and culture, you can subscribe to the Beijing Hour, a 1-hour podcast news magazine program. We welcome and appreciate all ratings and reviews. I'm Qi Zhi. Thank you for listening.